had been teaching combat strategy at the Galactic Military Academy for 17 cycles, and in all that time I had never encountered a species quite so entertainingly fragile as humans. My name is Velkara, and I am a Threxian, which means I stand roughly 3 meters tall, possess 4 arms each capable of crushing tritanium, and my exoskeleton can withstand plasma fire that would vaporize most organic matter. I was a decorated war veteran before I took this teaching position, having survived campaigns across 40 star systems. The Academy assigned me to advanced combat theory, a course specifically designed to weed out the weak, the slow, and the stupid. Failure rate? 92%. I took pride in that number. The semester began like any other. 230 cadets filed into my auditorium, representing 63 different species from across the coalition. There were Krill with their telepathic coordination, Borvaxians with their armored hides, Selkari who could phase through solid matter, and tucked in the back corner, looking impossibly small and soft, was the human. One single human girl. She had brown hair pulled back in what humans call a ponytail, unremarkable brown eyes, and stood maybe 1.6 meters tall. Her uniform hung on her frame like she was a child playing dress-up in her parents' clothes. When I say she looked fragile, I mean she looked like she might shatter if someone sneezed too hard in her direction. Her name was Kira Vance, and I barely noticed her that first day. "Welcome to Advanced Combat Theory," I announced, my voice resonating through the chamber with the natural harmonic depth of my species. 80% of you will fail this course. Of the 20% who pass, half will die in your first real engagement. These are not predictions, these are statistics. If you are not prepared to learn from failure, if you cannot adapt faster than your enemy can kill you, then you should leave now and save us all the time. Nobody left. They never do on the first day. Your first assignment is simple, I continued, activating the holo display that showed a 3-dimensional battlefield scenario. You will work in assigned teams of 5 to complete a tactical simulation. The scenario is based on the Battle of Krovan IV, where a coalition strike force was ambushed by Zarkith insurgents. Your objective is to minimize casualties while securing the primary target. You have 72 hours. Dismiss. The cadets shuffled out, already forming their groups, checking their assignments on their personal displays. I watched Kira Vance walk out alone, clutching her datapad against her chest like a shield. Soft, I thought. She would not last a week. I was wrong, but not in the way I expected. 72 hours later, the teams presented their solutions. It went exactly as I anticipated. Most groups had developed variations of the same basic strategy: flanking maneuvers, suppressing fire, standard small unit tactics, competent but uninspired. A few teams tried something clever and got their entire simulated squad killed in the first 30 seconds. Then came Team 17. Kira Vance stood at the front of her group, which consisted of a Krill named Thix, a Borvaxian called Granol, a Selkari who went by Whisper, and an insectoid Chitik named Clack. The human looked even smaller standing next to her teammates, but she held her datapad steady as she activated the presentation. Our solution resulted in 0 friendly casualties and full objective completion in under 4 minutes, she said, her voice quiet but clear. Several cadets laughed. 0 casualties. Impossible. The scenario was designed specifically to force difficult choices, to teach that sometimes soldiers die and commanders have to accept that reality. I leaned forward in my seat. Proceed. She ran the simulation. I watched with growing interest as her team's approach unfolded. Instead of engaging the ambush at all, they had identified a flaw in the enemy's positioning, a 12-second window during their patrol rotation where an entire section of their perimeter went unwatched. The strike team slipped through that gap, bypassed the ambush entirely, secured the objective, and extracted before the enemy even knew they were there. It was elegant. It was efficient. It was completely contrary to the point of the exercise. "Cadet Vance," I said when the simulation ended. "The purpose of this assignment was to learn how to fight through an ambush, not avoid it. The assignment was to minimize casualties while securing the objective." "Instructor," she replied, glancing down at her datapad. "Those were the exact parameters you specified. You said nothing about mandatory engagement. In real combat you will not always have the luxury of avoidance. In real combat an enemy that never knows I was there cannot kill my soldiers," she countered. "Instructor, why would I sacrifice my people in a fight I do not need to have?" The auditorium went silent. Several species do not understand the concept of rhetorical questions, so the sudden quiet felt heavier than it should have. I stared at the small human girl who had just questioned my teaching methodology in front of 200 of her peers. I should have been angry. Instead, I was amused. Your logic is sound, but you have missed the educational objective, I said. Nevertheless, Team 17 receives full marks. Well done. Kira nodded and returned to her seat. I made a mental note about her. Clever, but inexperienced. She would learn. The semester continued. Each week brought new scenarios, new challenges, new opportunities for cadets to fail spectacularly. And fail they did. By week 4, 60 cadets had dropped the course. By week 8, we were down to 9. Kira Vance remained. More than that, she thrived. Every assignment, every simulation, every tactical problem I threw at the class, she found solutions that were unconventional, unpredictable, and frustratingly effective. She did not fight like the other species, where Krill relied on telepathic coordination and Borvaxians used brute force. Kira approached combat like a puzzle to be solved rather than a contest to be won. She also asked questions. Constantly. Instructor Velkara, why did the coalition forces at the Battle of Themis III maintain their defensive position instead of retreating to better ground? Instructor, this tactical doctrine assumes the enemy will respond rationally, but what if they do not care about their own casualties? Instructor, why do we train for frontal assaults when statistically ambush and guerrilla tactics have a 73% higher success rate? I answered her questions at first patiently, then with growing irritation. She was not challenging me out of disrespect. She genuinely wanted to understand, but her questions revealed an uncomfortable truth. Much of what we taught at the academy was based on tradition, on the way wars had always been fought, rather than cold tactical efficiency. Humans, I was learning, did not care much for tradition when survival was on the line. Week 12 brought the midterm examination, a multi-day field exercise conducted in the academy's combat dome, a fully customizable environment that could simulate any battlefield condition. The scenario was brutal. Cadets were divided into two forces, attackers and defenders. The defenders held a fortified position with limited resources. The attackers had superior numbers but had to cross open ground. It was based on historical battles from a dozen different species, conflicts where thousands died for a few meters of territory. I assigned Kira to the defending force, curious to see how she would handle a scenario where avoidance was not an option. She would have to fight. She would have to make the hard choices. She would learn that sometimes soldiers die. The exercise began at dawn. I watched from the observation deck alongside other instructors as the attacking force, led by a talented Krill named Zixthor, organized their assault. They had the numbers, the firepower, and a solid plan. The defending force, commanded by a Borvaxian veteran named Thorask, prepared their fortifications and settled in for a long, bloody fight. Kira Vance was assigned to a squad holding the eastern wall, the least critical position in the defensive line. The first wave hit hard. Plasma fire lit up the morning sky as attackers charged across the killing field. The defenders held, barely, losing 3 positions but maintaining their core stronghold. It was going exactly as I had designed it, bloody, desperate, educational. Then something strange happened. The attacking force suddenly wheeled east, abandoning their frontal assault to hit the supposedly weak point where Kira's squad was stationed. Zixthor had identified the vulnerability and was exploiting it brilliantly. His forces would punch through, roll up the defensive line from the flank, and end the exercise in a decisive victory. Except when they reached the eastern wall, Kira's squad was not there. The fortifications were empty. Zixthor's forces breached the wall and found nothing but automated turrets on timers, which activated the moment the attackers entered kill range. Half of Zixthor's assault force was eliminated in seconds. While the attackers were dying in the trap, Kira's squad had circled around behind them, completely abandoning their defensive position to strike at the attackers' supply depot. Without ammunition, without medical supplies, without food or water, the attacking force could not sustain their assault. Zixthor tried to adapt, splitting his forces to defend his rear while maintaining pressure on the front, but it was too late. Kira had disappeared into the terrain with her squad, popping up to hit supply convoys, ambush isolated units, and generally make the attacking force's life miserable. The exercise was supposed to last 3 days. It ended in 18 hours when Zixthor was forced to surrender due to unsustainable losses and complete supply collapse. I called both commanders to my office immediately after. Thorask arrived first, his massive Borvaxian frame barely fitting through the door. Instructor, I must apologize. Cadet Vance disobeyed my direct orders. I told her to hold that wall and she abandoned her position without authorization. I am aware, I said. Then Kira arrived, still in her combat gear, dirt smudged across her face. She looked exhausted but alert. Cadet Vance, I began. You were ordered to defend the eastern wall. Instead, you abandoned your post, left your defensive line vulnerable, and conducted unauthorized raids against enemy logistics. Explain yourself. She met my eyes without flinching. The eastern wall could not be held, Instructor. Zixthor had 4 times our numbers and better positioning. If we stayed, my entire squad would have been wiped out in the first engagement, and the breach would have happened anyway. So you ran, Thorask growled. So I adapted, Kira corrected. Instructor Valkara, you have told us repeatedly that the objective matters more than the method. Our objective was to prevent the attacking force from taking the stronghold. We achieved that objective by eliminating their ability to sustain an assault. The eastern wall was not important. Winning was important. I studied her for a long moment. She was right, tactically speaking. She had won the exercise through unconventional means, sacrificing pride and protocol for effectiveness. It was exactly the kind of thinking that won real wars. It was also exactly the kind of thinking that got soldiers court-martialed. Cadet Vance, in a real military organization, you would be facing disciplinary action for disobeying orders, I said. In a real military organization, I would have requested permission to execute my plan, she replied. This was a training exercise. I made the choice to win rather than follow orders. I believed were tactically unsound. If that was wrong, then I accept whatever consequences you deem appropriate, Instructor. But I will not apologize for keeping my soldiers alive. The audacity. The absolute gall of this tiny human to stand in my office and lecture me about tactics. I should have failed her on the spot. Instead, I started laughing. It was a deep, resonating sound that made both cadets step back. I laughed because in 17 cycles of teaching, I had never had a student so perfectly embody the chaotic, unpredictable, absolutely maddening nature of actual combat. War was not about following the rules. War was about winning. And this small, soft, fragile human understood that better than most of my veteran instructors. Cadet Vance, you receive full marks, I said once I stopped laughing. Thorask, you receive a passing grade for at least trying to maintain your defensive line. Both of you are dismissed. They left, Thorask looking confused, and Kira looking quietly satisfied. That should have been the end of it. A brilliant student, an unconventional thinker, someone who would graduate with honors, and go on to do interesting things in the coalition military. But 3 weeks later, everything changed. The final examination was announced. One last simulation, one ultimate test. Every remaining cadet, all 41 of them, would participate. The scenario was classified until the day of the exam, but rumors spread quickly. It would be the hardest thing we had ever thrown at them. It would be impossible. It would teach them that sometimes failure is inevitable, and how they handle that failure would determine what kind of officers they became. I designed the scenario myself. I made it absolutely, completely, mathematically unwinnable, and I could not wait to see what Kira Vance would do when she finally, inevitably failed. The final examination scenario loaded into the combat dome at exactly 0600 hours. 41 cadets stood in formation waiting for me to explain the parameters of their last test. The air smelled of nervous sweat and anticipation, a mix of pheromones from 24 different species creating an almost visible haze in the morning light. I took my time walking to the podium, letting the tension build. This was theater as much as education, and I had learned over the years that psychological pressure revealed just as much about a soldier as tactical skill. Cadets, I began, my forearms clasped behind my back in the traditional Threxian posture of authority. Your final examination begins now. The scenario is as follows. You are a coalition rapid response team deployed to evacuate a civilian research station on the moon of Talaxis Prime. Intelligence reports indicate a Vorthan raider fleet will arrive in 6 hours. The station houses 273 scientists, support staff, and their families. I activated the holo display. The research station materialized in the air above us, a sprawling complex of interconnected domes and tunnels built into the moon's rocky surface. Your transport can carry a maximum of 50 passengers per trip, I continued. Travel time to the nearest safe harbor is 90 minutes each way. You have access to standard defensive equipment, limited ammunition, and no reinforcements. The Vorthan fleet consists of 12 warships with ground assault capabilities. When they arrive, anything remaining on that moon will be destroyed or captured. I watched the cadets do the math in their heads. 6 hours, 90 minutes per trip, 50 people per transport. Even under perfect conditions, they could only evacuate 150 civilians maximum. 123 people would be left behind. 123 people would die, and there was absolutely nothing they could do about it. You have 30 seconds to organize your command structure, I said. Begin. The cadets erupted into controlled chaos, species grouping together, voices rising as they argued over who should lead. I noticed Kira standing perfectly still, her eyes distant, already running simulations in her head while her classmates wasted precious seconds on politics. A krill named Vexnell emerged as the primary commander through sheer telepathic dominance, forcing the other candidates to acknowledge his authority. Not the choice I would have made, but acceptable. He immediately began barking orders, dividing the cadets into evacuation teams, security details, and logistics coordinators. Kira was assigned to Security Team 3, a low-priority position guarding the southern perimeter. Again, she was placed where she supposedly could not interfere with the main operation. Vexenil clearly remembered what happened during the midterm. The simulation began. The cadets moved with impressive efficiency, establishing their command post, organizing the panicked civilians into evacuation queues, and loading the first transport. Everything went smoothly. Too smoothly. I had designed this scenario with layers of complications, equipment failures, civilian panic, medical emergencies, everything that could go wrong in a real evacuation. But the cadets handled each crisis with competence born from a semester of brutal training. The first transport launched on schedule. 50 civilians saved. 223 remained. Second transport, 90 minutes later. 100 civilians saved. 173 remained. I watched Kira on the monitors. While her teammates scanned the perimeter for threats that would not arrive for hours, she was talking to the civilians in her sector, asking questions, taking notes on her datapad. Several times she left her post to examine the research station's infrastructure, poking through maintenance tunnels and service corridors. Her team leader reprimanded her twice for abandoning her position. She acknowledged the reprimands and immediately went back to whatever she was doing. Third transport. 150 civilians saved. 123 remained. This was when cadets typically began to crack. The reality of the situation would settle in. They could not save everyone. They would have to choose who lived and who died. I had watched this scenario break decorated officers. It would certainly break students. Vexenale handled it better than most. He organized the remaining civilians by essential personnel. Scientists with critical knowledge would be prioritized. Families with children would be next. Everyone else would be left behind. It was cold, practical, and exactly what military doctrine demanded. The civilians who realized they were being left to die reacted predictably. Some begged, some threatened, some simply sat down and waited for death with whatever dignity they could muster. Fourth transport loaded. Vexenil stood at the loading ramp, checking names against his list, condemning people with every stroke of his stylus. That was when Kira walked into the command post. "Commander Vexenil, I need to speak with you immediately," she said. "I am occupied, Cadet Vance," he replied without looking up from his datapad. "Return to your post." "Sir, I have found a solution to evacuate everyone." The command post went silent. Every cadet, every simulated civilian within earshot, turned to stare at the small human girl who had just claimed the impossible. Vexenil finally looked at her. "Explain." "This research station has been studying exotic matter for the past 8 years. Kira said, speaking quickly. "Their primary experiment involves a prototype matter compression device designed to reduce the physical space occupied by objects without changing their mass. It is currently configured for cargo containers, but I spoke with Dr. Halvix, their lead scientist. With modifications, the device could be used on the transport ship itself." "You want to compress the ship?" Vexenil asked incredulously. "No, sir, I want to compress the interior cargo space. We expand the internal volume of the transport without changing its external dimensions. Basic spatial engineering. The same principle the Korath use for their dimensional storage units. Just scaled up. Dr. Halvix estimates we could increase passenger capacity by 60%. Maybe more." I leaned forward in my observation chair. Clever. Insanely risky. Potentially catastrophic if the compression field failed, but theoretically possible. "How long would these modifications take?" Vexenil demanded. 40 minutes if we start now, sir. The doctor and his team are already standing by." Vexenil looked at the chronometer. The fourth transport was scheduled to launch in 12 minutes. If they delayed to make modifications, they would lose an entire evacuation cycle. If the modifications failed, they would lose even more time and potentially the transport itself. It was a gamble. The safe choice was to continue with the current plan, accept the losses, and evacuate who they could. The risky choice was to trust the unproven technology proposed by a human cadet who had a reputation for breaking rules. I watched Vexnil make his decision. "Proceed," he ordered. "But if this fails, Cadet Vance, those deaths are on you." "Understood, sir," Kira replied, and ran toward the research labs. The next 40 minutes were frantic. Dr. Halvix and his team swarmed over the transport, reconfiguring their prototype, rerouting power systems, praying to whatever gods their species believed in that the math was correct. Kira worked alongside them, her smaller frame squeezing into access panels the larger scientists could not reach, her hands steady even as the chronometer counted down the minutes until the Vorthan fleet arrived. I pulled up her academy file while I watched her work. Age 22, from a planet called Earth in a relatively isolated sector. High marks in theoretical tactics, but mediocre scores in physical combat trials. Psych evaluation noted tendencies toward unconventional thinking and authority questioning. Recommended for intelligence analysis rather than field command, and yet here she was, covered in grease and coolant, rewiring an experimental device that could either save 200 people or kill everyone on that transport, when the compression field collapsed and turned them all into organic paste. The modifications finished with 6 minutes to spare. The transport's interior now shimmered with a faint blue glow as the compression field activated. The cargo bay that should have held 50 people now had space for 82 according to the readouts. They loaded every person they could fit. Civilians packed in shoulder to shoulder, some species having to contort their bodies in uncomfortable ways, but they fit. All 82 of them. The transport launched. I held my breath despite myself, waiting for the field to fail, for the ship to implode, for Kira's gamble to end in disaster. The transport reached orbit, jumped to faster than light, arrived at the safe harbor, 90 minutes later without incident. 82 people saved. 91 remained on the station. One more trip? That was all they needed. One more trip and everyone would survive, except the chronometer showed 4 hours and 20 minutes elapsed. 1 hour and 40 minutes until the Vorthan fleet arrived. 90 minutes for the transport to return. 30 minutes to load. 90 minutes to reach safety. 3 hours and 30 minutes. Minimum. They were going to be 10 minutes short. I saw the realization spread through the command post. Cadets checked their calculations, hoping they had made an error. But the math was absolute and unforgiving. They had done everything right. They had found an impossible solution and executed it perfectly. And 91 people were still going to die because the universe did not care about fairness or effort or brilliant improvisations. This was the real lesson. This was what I needed them to understand. Sometimes you do everything right and people still die. Sometimes there is no clever trick, no unexpected solution, no last-minute miracle. Sometimes you just lose. Vexinale sat down at the command console, his telepathic field broadcasting defeat so strongly that even non-telepathic species could feel it. Other cadets stood frozen, their training insufficient to process the emotional weight of impending mass casualties. Kira walked past them all, out of the command post toward the southern perimeter where the remaining civilians waited. I switched the monitor to follow her. She gathered the 91 people who would be left behind. Families holding each other. Scientists who had devoted their lives to expanding the boundaries of knowledge. Support staff who had kept the station running. Children who did not fully understand why the nice soldiers were leaving without them. "I need to know something," Kira said, her voice carrying across the crowd. "How many of you are willing to die?" The question was so absurd, so tonally inappropriate that several civilians actually laughed. "I am serious," she continued. "The transport will return in 90 minutes. It will take 30 minutes to load everyone. It will take 90 minutes to reach safety. The Vorthan fleet will arrive 10 minutes before we can jump to faster than light. In those 10 minutes we will be completely vulnerable. If they fire on us, everyone dies. Not just the 91 people here. Everyone. All 273 civilians plus 41 cadets. So I need to know who here is willing to bet their life that we can survive 10 minutes against 12 warships." Silence. Then a Turellian scientist raised her hand. Then a human child, maybe 8 years old. Then more hands, tentacles, appendages of various descriptions, all 91 of them. "Then we have work to do," Kira said. Every defensive weapon this station has, I need it powered up and ready. Every piece of technology that can be repurposed. Every experimental device. Every prototype, We are going to make those 10 minutes so absolutely miserable for the Vorthans that they will think twice before firing on a transport full of civilians. She turned to look directly at the camera. I was watching through. Instructor, Velkara, I know you are watching. I know this is a simulation. I know you designed this to be unwinnable, but I am about to teach you something humans learned a long time ago. There is a difference between a battle you cannot win and a battle you refuse to lose. Then she smiled. And it was not a nice smile. The next 90 minutes were absolute chaos. Kira transformed that research station into a nightmare. Experimental weapons that were never meant to see combat were hastily armed and aimed at the approach vector. The compression device was reconfigured into a spatial distortion mine. The station's reactor was rigged to overload on command, turning the entire facility into a bomb if necessary. The transport returned. Loading began. The Vorthan fleet dropped out of faster than light exactly on schedule. 12 warships against one unarmed research station, and a transport full of civilians. It should have been a massacre. The Vorthans opened communications demanding surrender. Kira responded by firing every weapon the station had. Most missed. The few that connected did negligible damage to military-grade shields, but that was not the point. The point was to announce that this would not be an easy target. This would be a fight. The Vorthians adjusted their approach, spreading out, preparing to return fire. Kira detonated the spatial distortion mine. Reality twisted. 3 Vorthan ships suddenly found themselves occupying the same physical space as each other. The collision was spectacular. Debris scattered across the lunar surface as secondary explosions tore through the wreckage. 9 ships remained. The transport finished loading. All 91 civilians were aboard. The pilot requested clearance to launch. Negative. Kira transmitted. Hold position. Give me 5 more minutes. Cadet, the Vorthans are targeting us. The pilot responded, panic creeping into his voice. I know. Hold position. The Vorthans fired. Plasma bolts streaked toward the transport. Kira activated the station's emergency energy barriers. Systems designed to protect against micrometeorites and solar radiation now pushed to maximum output and focused entirely on the transport's position. The plasma bolts splashed against the barriers, overloading them instantly, but buying precious seconds. 3 minutes. Kira called out. The Vorthans launched fighters. Small, fast attack craft that could slip through the station's limited defenses and tear apart the transport. Kira vented the station's atmosphere in a controlled decompression, creating a cloud of frozen particles that played havoc with the fighters' targeting systems. She fired every remaining weapon blindly into the cloud, not aiming for hits but creating a wall of exploding ordnance that the fighters had to navigate. 2 fighters collided with debris. 3 more took damage and retreated. The rest pressed forward. 1 minute, Kira said. The transport launched, its engines straining as it climbed out of the moon's weak gravity well. The fighters pursued, plasma fire stitching across the transport's shields. Kira stood alone in the research station's command center, every other cadet having evacuated with the civilians. She watched the transport climb, watched the fighters close in, watched the chronometer count down. 30 seconds, 20 seconds. The transport's shields failed. 1 more hit and the hull would breach. 10 seconds. Kira triggered the station's reactor overload. The explosion consumed everything within a 5-kilometer radius. The research station, the Vorthan fighters, and very nearly the transport itself, which was thrown forward by the shockwave like a leaf in a hurricane, but it was thrown in the right direction. The transport jumped to faster than light with 2 seconds to spare. 0 casualties. The simulation ended. I sat in my observation chair, all 4 of my arms completely still, staring at the readouts that confirmed what I had just witnessed. She had won. She had beaten an unwinnable scenario by being willing to sacrifice herself, by recognizing that survival did not have to include everyone, just everyone she was responsible for protecting. The cadets filed back into the auditorium, exhausted, traumatized, but victorious. They celebrated different species, exchanging congratulations in a dozen languages. Kira walked in last, alone as always, and took her seat in the back corner. I let them celebrate for exactly 60 seconds. Then I spoke. Silence. The auditorium went quiet instantly. You are all pleased with yourselves, I said, my voice flat. You believe you have accomplished something remarkable. You believe you have won. I activated the holo display showing a detailed breakdown of the simulation. Let me explain why you have all failed. The celebration died immediately. Confusion rippled through the cadets. The scenario you just completed was designed to teach you a fundamental truth about warfare. You cannot save everyone. Sacrifice is inevitable. Your duty as officers is to make the hard choices, to accept losses, and to complete your mission despite the cost. Instead, you gambled. You relied on unproven technology, you delayed evacuation schedules, and you put every single life at risk for the sake of saving a few more. I looked directly at Kira. Cadet Vance, your final actions were particularly egregious. You remained behind alone, in a doomed facility. If this had been a real operation, you would be dead. Your death would serve no purpose. It would not change the outcome. It would simply be a waste of a trained officer. This is unacceptable. She stood up, and for the first time all semester I saw anger in her eyes. Instructor Velkara, she said, her voice shaking slightly. May I ask you a question? Proceed. Why did we fail? I have just explained in detail why you failed. Were you not paying attention? No, instructor. I mean, why did we fail? What was the tactical error? What mistake did we make that resulted in mission failure? I stared at her. Your methods were reckless and dangerous. You violated standard evacuation protocols. You put civilian lives at unnecessary risk. But did we fail the mission? She pressed. The objective was to evacuate all civilians from the research station before the Vorthan fleet arrived. We evacuated all 273 civilians. 0 casualties. Mission accomplished. So again I ask, Instructor, why did we fail? Because in a real combat situation, your approach would have resulted in disaster, I said, my voice rising. You cannot rely on luck and desperation. You cannot assume experimental technology will function perfectly. You cannot throw yourself into suicidal last stands and expect to survive. You are right, Instructor, Kira said. In a real combat situation, many of the things we did today would have failed. The compression device might have malfunctioned. The fighters might have destroyed the transport. The reactor explosion might have been mistimed. Any number of variables could have gone wrong. She paused, then continued. But you did not fail us because we might have died. You failed us because we succeeded in a way you did not anticipate. You designed an unwinnable scenario because you wanted to teach us that sometimes people die and we have to accept that. But humans learned a different lesson in our history, Instructor. We learned that the word impossible just means nobody has figured out how to do it yet. The auditorium was absolutely silent now. Every cadet, every species, every individual was watching this tiny human challenge a decorated war veteran twice her age and 3 times her size. You want to teach us to accept failure, Kira said, but I refuse. I refuse to accept that 123 people had to die. I refuse to accept that we should prioritize some lives over others. I refuse to accept that following protocol is more important than saving lives, and I refuse to accept a failing grade for succeeding at the mission you gave us. She looked around at her fellow cadets, then back at me. So here's my question, Instructor Velkara. If we completed the objective with 0 casualties using tactics that worked within the simulation parameters you created, then the failure is not ours. The failure is yours. You failed to create a truly unwinnable scenario. You failed to account for unconventional thinking. You failed to understand that humans do not accept no-win situations. We rewrite the rules. We change the game. We find a way or we make one. She sat back down. So unless you can identify a specific tactical error that resulted in mission failure, I submit that you should not be failing us, Instructor. You should be learning from us. For a long moment, I could not speak. 17 cycles of teaching. Hundreds of students. Dozens of species. And never, not once had anyone had the audacity to suggest that I was the one who needed to learn. I should have thrown her out of my academy. I should have had her expelled for insubordination. I should have crushed this arrogant human who dared to question me. Instead, I started laughing again. It began as a low rumble and built into a full harmonic resonance that shook the walls. I laughed because she was absolutely infuriatingly brilliantly correct. I had failed them. I had designed a scenario meant to break their spirits, to teach them to accept defeat, and they had rejected my lesson entirely. They had done something I had never considered possible. They had taught me instead. When I finally stopped laughing, I looked at Kira Vance and saw not a fragile human girl but a warrior who fought battles in ways I had never imagined. You are correct, Cadet Vance, I said. I have failed you all, not as students, but as a teacher. I have been teaching you to fight the last war instead of preparing you for the next one. I have been limiting you to tactics and protocols designed for species who do not think the way humans think. I deactivated the failure notice on the holo display. Congratulations, cadets. You have all passed advanced combat theory. But more than that, you have reminded me why we teach in the first place. Not to create soldiers who follow orders blindly, but to create leaders who question everything, including their instructor. I looked directly at Kira, especially their instructors. The semester ended 3 weeks later. Graduation ceremonies were held with appropriate pomp and ceremony. Kira Vance graduated top of her class, earning commendations from multiple instructors and a guaranteed position in Coalition Strategic Command. I submitted my own report to the Academy administration recommending a complete overhaul of the combat theory curriculum to account for human perspectives and methodologies. On the last day, Kira came to my office. Instructor Valkara, she said, I wanted to thank you. For failing you? I asked. For making me prove you wrong, she replied. For creating challenges hard enough that I had to think differently to overcome them. For being exactly the kind of teacher I needed. Even if neither of us realized it at first, she held out her hand. A human gesture of respect. I reached down with one of my forearms and shook it gently, careful not to crush her fragile bones. Cadet Vance, I have a question for you now, I said. Why did you choose to attend the academy? Humans are new to the coalition. Your species has no military tradition with us. You could have stayed on Earth, lived a comfortable life. Why come here? She smiled. Because someone has to teach the galaxy that humans do not give up. Someone has to show them that we will find a way to win even when the universe says we cannot. And someone has to make sure that the next time an instructor tries to teach a lesson about acceptable losses, there is a human in the room to say no. She turned to leave, then paused at the door. Besides, instructor, you never asked the most important question, which is, if the scenario was unwinnable, why did you bother teaching it at all? Maybe, somewhere deep down, you wanted someone to prove you wrong. Maybe you wanted a student to show you that impossible is just another word for not yet achieved. Maybe you were waiting for someone like me all along. She left without waiting for an answer. I sat alone in my office for a long time after that, thinking about unwinnable scenarios and the stubborn species who refused to accept them. Humans, I decided, were going to change everything about how the galaxy fought its wars, and I could not wait to see what they did next.